There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a dinner table when a name is spoken that should not have been spoken. And I want you to understand, before I tell you anything else about this evening, that this sort of silence is not the comfortable kind. It does not invite reflection. It invites panic. The dinner at Duncastle Hall was a modest affair by most standards. 8 guests around a candlelit table in the Lake District in November, with the wind off the fells and pushing at the window glass and the fire working hard at one end of the room. Lord Duncastle had not, in the 2 years since he had retreated from London to this house, shown any great enthusiasm for company, and the gathering existed largely because his old friend Mr. Rawlings had arrived that afternoon from London quite without warning, and dinner had to be served regardless. Miss Ruth Farleigh sat toward the lower end of the table, as she always did, in her capacity as governess to Lord Duncastle's young niece. She was not, strictly speaking, expected to dine with the guests. But Nell had been feverish that week, and Miss Farleigh had spent 3 days barely leaving the child's side. And Lord Duncastle had told her, with considerably more warmth than his usual manner suggested he possessed, that she ought to eat a proper meal for once, and that the dining room was perfectly able to accommodate one more quiet person. She was seated near the lower end of the table, listening to Mr. Rawlings hold forth about a particular theatre season in London, when that gentleman paused mid-sentence, tipped his head to one side, and looked at her with the sudden bright-eyed certainty of a man who has just resolved a puzzle that has been nagging at him since tea-time. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Rawlings, setting down his wine-glass, "but are you not Miss Corwen? Miss Annalise Corwen, daughter of the Earl of Corwen? I was quite certain I saw you at the Alderton reception some 3 years past." The silence that followed was, as I have told you, not the comfortable kind. "I am going to stop us right there," before Miss Farleigh says a single word in answer, "because there is a great deal you need to understand before I let this evening go any further. About who Miss Ruth Farleigh actually was. About how she came to be sitting at that particular table in that particular house in the Lake District, under a name she had borrowed from a school friend's maiden aunt, and about why an unmistakable air of a woman. About why the man sitting at the head of that table, who had gone very still at Mr. Rawlings' question, in a way that had nothing to do with dinner-party manners, and everything to do with the expression of a man who has just understood something enormous, mattered to her more than she had ever permitted herself to say aloud. But before I take you back to where this all began, I want to ask you one small thing. If this is the first fire of mine you have ever sat beside, welcome to Moonlight at Bellwood. There are a great many more evenings like this one, and every story is worth the staying for. The subscribe button is just below this video, and it costs you nothing at all, and it means the next story finds you the moment I have it ready. Press it before we go any further, and we will consider the matter entirely settled between us. And if you will not, well, I keep very careful records, I always have. Now, let me take you back 7 months, to the drawing-room of a townhouse in Mayfair, where a young woman of 26 sat reading a letter that had, in the space of 1 paragraph, overturned the careful shape of her entire future. Miss Annalise Corwen, for that was her true name, and I will call her by it for now, while I still can do so without complicated qualifications, was the only surviving daughter of the Earl of Corwen, a man of considerable rank and considerably less financial discipline than rank ideally requires. The Earl had been losing at cards for the better part of a decade, and losing, moreover, in the particular stubborn, escalating way of men who believe that the next hand will surely correct the accumulated damage of the previous 40. It had not corrected it. What it had done by the spring of 1822 was produce a debt of such magnitude that the Earl found himself requiring either a miracle or a solution, and miracles being in short supply that season, he had settled upon a solution. The solution was Sir Mortimer Tench. Sir Mortimer was 57 years old, a widower of 2 previous wives, both of whom had died, as far as anyone in London society could determine, of sheer dispirited exhaustion, and possessed of a fortune substantial enough to absorb the Earl's debts entirely, in exchange for what Sir Mortimer considered a perfectly reasonable request. He wished to marry again. He had, at a recent dinner, taken notice of Miss Corwen. He was prepared to be very generous. The Earl was prepared to be very grateful. What neither man had troubled himself to consult was Miss Corwen herself. She read the letter twice. Then she sat for a long time in the drawing-room while the afternoon light changed and the fire burned lower, turning the whole shape of what was being asked of her slowly over in her mind. She was not, I should tell you, a woman given to easy dramatics. She had grown up inside the careful, formal constraints of a great house, and she had learned early to keep most of what she actually thought and felt in a register that only she could hear. She had watched her mother do the same. Quietly, competently, and at considerable inner cost, for the whole of her childhood, and she had promised herself across those when the time came, that she would find some other way to live when the time came. The time had apparently come. It was her aunt who made the alternative possible. Lady Sophronia Corwen, her father's elder sister, a woman who had spent 40 years being quietly and firmly inconvenient to every expectation the family had ever held of her, kept a small independent household in Yorkshire, and it was to this household that Annalise went, ostensibly for a fortnight's rest, with her father's blessing and a small trunk, and from which she did not return in anything like the manner anyone expected. Lady Sophronia had, over those 40 independent years, developed a wide and useful acquaintance. Among these acquaintances was a land agent who managed properties for several northern families, and through the hearing of it, she had learned of a situation that struck her as precisely what her niece required. Viscount Duncastle of Duncastle Hall in the Lake District was in need of a governess for his late sister's child. The child was 7 years old. The Viscount was remote, difficult to read, and had, following the death of his wife 18 months prior, retreated from London entirely. He asked for competence and steadiness, and was prepared to offer generous terms. He had no interest whatsoever in personal history, provided the professional qualifications were satisfied. Lady Sophronia and her niece constructed, with a thoroughness that would have startled the Earl considerably had he known anything about it, the complete and entirely fictitious person of Miss Ruth Farleigh, a woman of modest, gentle birth, the daughter of a country clergyman now deceased, possessed of a small legacy sufficient for respectability and a genuine love of literature and the improving of young minds. The name came from the maiden aunt of a school friend of Annalise's, a woman who had died without issue 6 years prior, and whose existence appeared in no active record that a northern land agent was likely to consult. I want you to understand, before we go any further, why this particular deception mattered to Annalise beyond the plain practical necessity of escaping her father's arrangement, because it is the whole emotional engine of everything that followed. She had spent her entire life being encountered as the Earl of Corwen's daughter first, and as a person, only at some considerable distance afterward. Her intelligence, her opinions, the particular dry and observant humor she kept almost entirely to herself, all of it filtered through the enormous fact of her birth before anyone had thought to notice anything else, and she discovered, in the first weeks of her invented life in the Lake District, a freedom she had never once experienced before. The freedom of being valued for what she actually did, not for what she had been born to, or what she might one day be given in marriage, or how well she reflected on a family that had never once asked whether the reflection was accurate. Miss Ruth Farleigh was not an Earl's daughter performing a convenient diversion. Miss Ruth Farleigh was simply a woman who was very good at her work. And Annalise Corwen, wearing that name like a second skin, found that she had never in her life felt more genuinely like herself than she did inside it. Duncastle Hall arrived with a different atmosphere than she had expected. She had prepared herself for austerity, for a house that matched the character of a man who had closed himself away from the world. What she found instead was a house that seemed to be slowly forgetting that it was allowed to be a home. Beautiful rooms, Good furniture, no books left open on chairs, no flowers in the hall, no evidence that anyone had recently sat by the fire for the pleasure of it, rather than the necessity. And in the middle of all this careful suspended emptiness, there was Nell. Nell was 7 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of the particular watchful intelligence of a child who has lost too much too soon, and is not yet sure how much of herself it is safe to offer to any new person who comes into her life. She had lost her parents within 6 months of each other, and had come to her uncle's house with the quietness of a child who has learned that grief makes less trouble for the adults around it if it remains largely invisible. On the first afternoon, Annalise sat with her for an hour without attempting any lessons and asked her what she liked. Nell told her, after a long pause in which she was clearly deciding whether the question was genuine, that she liked drawing horses, that she had once had a dog, and that she thought most lessons were boring, but did not mind reading if the books were good ones. When Lord Duncastle looked in on them at 5 o'clock, he found the two of them at the table, Nell working on a sketch of a horse, while Miss Farleigh read aloud from a volume of natural history she had found on the nursery shelf. The sketch was better than anything the child had produced in the previous 6 months. Lord Duncastle stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he withdrew without interrupting, and said nothing about it at dinner. But he noticed, he continued, across the weeks that followed to notice. He was not, I should tell you, a man whose notice was comfortable to be under. Lord Piers Duncastle was 35, tall, with a manner so carefully controlled that most people left his company unsure whether he had found them interesting or entirely invisible. He had read law before inheriting the Viscountcy, and had brought to both Coulsings the same precise, watchful attention to what was actually being said, beneath the surface of what was said aloud. He watched Miss Farleigh with the same careful attention he applied to everything, and what he observed across those October and November weeks was this. She was extremely good at her work, not good in the efficient, professional way of someone performing a function. Good in the way of someone who genuinely cared how the work came out, who had brought a quality of personal investment to the position that the position did not strictly require. There was an afternoon in early November when he came upon her in the library. He had not expected to find anyone there. He had gone in for a particular book on land management, and found instead Miss Farleigh standing at the shelves near the window, still in her day dress, entirely absorbed in a volume she had pulled down while intending, he would learn later, only to return something Nell had borrowed. She did not hear him enter. He could at that moment have retreated without her knowing he had been there at all. A woman, he did not, which surprised him somewhat. "I hope," he said, "that you found something worth the detour." She startled, and then collected herself with a speed that told him she had some practice at not being flustered. "I beg your pardon, my lord. I was returning Miss Nell's book, and yes, I found several somethings." She held up the volume. It was a collection of letters by a Scottish naturalist, published the previous decade, which he had bought and never finished. "I didn't know you had this. It's wonderful." He had not expected that. He crossed the room and looked at the page she had been reading, and was surprised into saying what he actually thought, rather than the polite and non-committal thing he had been preparing. They talked for 20 minutes about the naturalist's letters, and about landscape, and about what it meant to observe something carefully enough to write about it honestly. Lord Duncastle, walking back to his study afterward, was aware of a feeling he had not experienced in some time, the feeling of having said what he actually meant to a person who had actually heard it. He noted this carefully and did not encourage it, and returned to his land management report with the slightly distracted air of a man trying to close a door that keeps swinging open in the wind. Then Nell took ill. She ran a fever that the doctor came to see and pronounced troublesome but manageable, and recommended rest and careful monitoring through the night. Lord Duncastle intended to arrange for the housekeeper to sit with the child, but when he looked in at 10:30, he found Miss Farleigh already there. not dozing in the chair, but wide awake in the low lamplight, reading to Nell in a murmur, quiet enough not to aggravate the child's headache, a cool cloth on the small hot forehead, her whole attention given entirely to the bureaucracy, to the business of keeping one 7-year-old comfortable through a difficult night. He sat with them. He did not entirely mean to. He had come only to check, but he pulled the other chair around and sat, and Miss Farleigh looked at him over Nell's head and said nothing, only shifted slightly to make the lamp useful for 2 readers instead of 1. They kept the watch together through the small hours of the morning. Nell slept just before 4. Lord Duncastle walked Miss Farleigh to the foot of the stairs and stood for a moment in the dim hall and said quietly, "Thank you," and meant it in a way that had considerably more behind it than the 2 words contained. "She's mine to care for," said Miss Farleigh, "as long as I am here." It was only afterward, lying awake in his own room, while the fells outside went pale with the first grey light, that he heard the weight she had placed on those last 4 words. "As long as I am here," as if she had already calculated that her time at Duncastle Hall was not permanent, and had constructed her care accordingly, and carried that knowledge very quietly by herself, in the way he was beginning to understand she carried most difficult things. He did not know what to do with this. So he did the only sensible thing a careful man can do with a feeling that has become more complicated than he intended. He did nothing, and was considerably more formal with her for the following week, and felt worse rather than better for it, as men generally do when they attempt to correct an emotional situation by pretending it is not there. And that is where matters stood. Lord Duncastle attempting to be correctly remote, and Miss Farleigh attempting to be correctly invisible, and both of them doing a thoroughly inadequate job of both, when Mr. Rawlings arrived from London, quite without warning, on the 23rd of November, and dinner had to be served, and the particular silence I described to you at the beginning of this evening fell over that candle-lit table like a stone dropped into still water. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Rawlings, "but are you not Miss Corwen, Miss Annalise Corwen?" She looked at him, and then she looked, for one unguarded moment, at Lord Duncastle, and Lord Duncastle, who had been watching her face across that for 7 months with the same careful attention he applied to everything, saw in that one unguarded moment everything he needed to understand. She excused herself from dinner 20 minutes later, citing a headache. She did not have a headache. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house settle around her and understood, with the clear-eyed despair of someone who has been braced for a thing for a long time and still finds its arrival worse than expected, that the name she had borrowed had just come to collect. Lord Duncastle knocked on her door at 10:30. She had expected him to wait until morning. She had expected formality and cold distance and the shuttered expression he kept for most of the world. What she had not expected was that he would look, when she opened the door, like a man who had spent 2 hours arriving at a decision and was not entirely reconciled to it, but had decided to make it regardless. "I think," he said, "that we ought to talk if you are willing." She was willing. They went to the small sitting room at the end of the hall. Not the formal drawing room, which would have made everything harder, and she told him everything. "My name is Annalise Corwen," she said. "My father is the Earl of Corwen, and I have been his daughter my entire life and my own person for the past 7 months, and I will not pretend to you that I am ashamed of the second of those things, even now that the first has come looking for me. My father has debts. The man he has chosen to settle them with is 57 years old and has outlived 2 wives, and I did not think, I could not accept, that the only life I was entitled to live was the one arranged around his convenience." She told him about Lady Sophronia, and about the name of Miss Ruth Farleigh, and about the carefully constructed reference letter. She told him it had not been easy to walk into his house under that name, and that it had become considerably less easy as the months passed. She told him the truth about Nell, that she had not pretended to love the child, that whatever had grown between them was as real as anything she had ever felt, and she was not prepared to call it a fiction because the name sitting over it was false. She did not, in that first telling, say anything about him. There are some truths that require the other truths to settle first. This was one of them. Lord Duncastle listened to the whole of it. She watched a careful procession of feeling move across his face, not the cold, shuttered expression he used for most of the world, but the one underneath it, the one that emerged when something had genuinely reached him. "You deceived me," he said finally, not angry, stating it precisely the way he stated everything. "Yes," she said, "and I am sorry for it in the way that a person can be sorry for a thing that was also, at the same time, the only decision available to them." "You could have left," he said, "when it became complicated. You could have found another position." "I could have," she agreed. "I chose not to. I think you understand why, my lord, if you will permit yourself to." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, without looking at her, "Does Ruth Farleigh exist at all, or only the name?" She considered this carefully. "Ruth Farleigh is the person I discovered I was capable of being," she said, "when no one was watching who I had been born to be. I cannot say she does not exist. I think she exists considerably more solidly than I had expected when I first borrowed her name." Lord Duncastle stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the fell country, going dark under a November sky. Then he turned and looked at her with the full direct regard that she had spent 7 months learning to endure without looking away. "Your father will come for you now," he said. "Yes," she said, "he will. And Sir Mortimer Tench." She had not told him the man's name. She understood, in the moment he said it, that he had known rather more about the Earl of Corwen's circumstances than he had let on over dinner, and that he had spent part of the previous 2 hours in productive thought. "He cannot force you," said Lord Duncastle, with a quietness that had something very certain behind it, "not if there is another arrangement already settled." He looked at her, steadily, and had the air of a man who is saying something with considerably more in it than the words themselves contain, trusting her to hear the whole of it. "I am asking you whether you would consider remaining at Duncastle Hall, not as Miss Farleigh, as yourself, under your own name, under mine eventually, if that is something you would consider." Annalise Corwen sat very still, in a small sitting room in the Lake District, on the 23rd of November, and understood that she was being offered the thing she had run away to find, not the false identity, not the borrowed name, but the genuine possibility of being chosen for exactly who she was. "I would consider it," she said. "I would consider it very seriously." He was not smiling. He almost never smiled. But there was something in his face in that moment that she recognized as the expression, living just underneath, where a smile would go in a man less carefully constructed. She recognized it because she had been watching for it across 7 months of library conversations and long dark nights in the nursery, with rather more attention than either of them had ever acknowledged. Her father, the Earl of Corwen, arrived at Duncastle Hall 4 days later, having received a letter from Lord Duncastle that managed to be both entirely formal and entirely unmistakable in its intention. The Earl was a tall man with the particular defeated air of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for too long and can no longer quite remember what he set down to pick it up. He arrived expecting to retrieve a runaway daughter. He found, instead, a daughter who stood beside a Viscount, of considerably greater estate than Sir Mortimer Tench, and informed him with a composure he had not seen in her, since she was old enough to form opinions of her own, that she was not coming home. The conversation that followed was not comfortable, and I am not going to pretend to you that it was. He said things about duty and family and debts accumulated through absolutely no involvement of hers. She said things about the last 7 months, and about Nell, and about what it had cost her to live honestly inside a name that was not her own. He said things about disappointment. She said that his disappointment in her decisions and her disappointment in his had something important in common, and that she would prefer they not spend the next decade, each pretending otherwise. The Earl was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice rather smaller than the one he had arrived with, that the Viscount had offered to settle the debt. Annalise said she knew. He said he did not deserve the help. She said that was probably true. He looked at her for a long time and then said quietly, "Your mother would have done exactly this." It was the first thing he had said that was not about himself, and they both understood what it cost him to say it. Annalise, who had spent her whole life watching her mother manage his consequences with graceful, exhausting silence, found that she was not entirely without feeling for the man standing before her, only that she was no longer willing to let his feelings rearrange the whole shape of her own. "I know she would have," she said. "I think that is precisely the point, Father." They were married in March, in the small church near Duncastle Hall, with Nell as a flower girl and Lady Sophronia as the only member of the family who arrived both early and without reservation. The Earl came too, because Lord Duncastle had sent a second letter, even more careful than the first, and because somewhere beneath all his accumulated failures, he did love his daughter, even if he had consistently loved his own comfort rather more successfully. Miss Annalise Corwen became Lady Duncastle, and ceased in the same moment to be Miss Ruth Farleigh, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mourn the borrowed name as much as she had expected to, because the things Ruth Farleigh had discovered in 7 months in that house, the steadiness, the competence, the particular quality of caring for someone else's child through a long dark night with no one watching, those things had never belonged to the invented name at all. They had always been hers. The name had only been the door she walked through to find them. Nell called her Aunt Annie, which was not a form of address that any previous introduction to Lady Duncastle's world would have produced, and which made Annalise laugh every time with a laugh that had nothing invented about it whatsoever. Lady Sophronia came to stay every autumn after that, and took a particular quiet satisfaction in watching the household her scheme had helped to build. She was heard to remark more than once, in the dry and settled way of a woman who has never needed anyone's approval and has therefore always been able to give her own honestly, that the finest decisions she had made in her long independent life were the ones she had made in clear and deliberate defiance of someone else's idea of what was appropriate. Annalise, listening, thought she was probably right. Lord Duncastle, sitting nearby with a book, did not look up. But he did, in the small and private way of a man who keeps his feelings close and releases them only in company he entirely trusts, smile. "If you ask me what this story is about, I will tell you it is about the particular freedom that lives on the other side of a borrowed name, and about what it costs to find it and what it means to keep it once you do." Annalise Corwen did not run away from her father's house to become someone else. She ran away to become herself, in a place where who her father was could not arrive before who she was. And Lord Duncastle, loving her honestly and precisely and without the weight of a title he already knew she held, discovered in the end that the truest thing about her had never been the name at all. Be gentle, my dears, with the people in your life who have once had to borrow a different self to survive the one that was assigned to them. Very often, the borrowed self turns out to be the real one. Very often, the name they finally laid down was the only false thing about them all along. Before I let this fire go low tonight, I want to say a warm word of thanks to those of you who have been sitting beside it for some time now. You know who you are, and I am grateful for every one of you in ways a quick word of thanks cannot properly convey. And if you are sitting here for the very first time tonight and find you would like to come back, the subscribe button is just below, and it takes only a moment, and it means the next story finds you without your having to go looking. Every love in these rooms is honestly earned. Every ending is the one that was deserved. Come back to me beneath the soft light of the evening star, where the borrowed names have all been laid down and the real ones spoken at last.